So as people are logging in, welcome everyone to this session of our Augmented Intelligence workshop. As you know, we are exploring here how our minds are aided by both social networks of other humans as well as our technical networks of various machines. Workshops is organized by Rob Goldstone and Marina Dubova from Indiana University, Gautam Biswas from Vanderbilt University, and myself. We have a number of people who have registered and visiting these talks regularly from 15 countries. We had a lot of speakers already, and today we have a wonderful setup of Iain Couzin and Alin Coman. We will be communicating as usual in different ways. We have our webpage, we have email, we have a Slack channel where you can post things that you want to keep more permanent. You can post also in the chat. That will not be recorded. And after the talks, please use the raise your hand function before speaking, and I will moderate the discussion. I think that's all I wanted to say. We are having this custom of not introducing our speakers too much because they're already famous, and you all have you can all Google them while they talk. So I will just let Iain start this session. Iain, take it away.
Thanks very much. And I can't see while I'm giving my talk, so if there's any questions, if someone could shout out, that would be awesome. Yes, I've always been fascinated by collective behavior. And what I try to focus on in my lab is try to understand whether there are sort of algorithmic principles regarding collective behavior across scales of biological organization. A very important part of this is theory. I really think that, both in terms of sort of detailed theories such as simulation, where we can capture many of the sort of spatial temporal aspects, but also increasingly using mathematical approaches to abstract and to generalize. This is very, very important. And I hope to show you today that the work we do wouldn't be possible without having this sort of foundational theory to build on. But of course, theory is not all that useful unless you have experiments with which to test and to further develop theory. And we do so both in the laboratory and also in the field. And of course, with these types of complex data, we also invest time and energy into visualizing and analyzing the types of communication networks, for example, that emerge from these studies. So all of those aspects tend to be incorporated into most of our work. And the theme is collective information processing. So unlike physical collectives like liquids, solids, gases, in biology, natural selection over hundreds of millions of years has explicitly shaped collective behavior around informational constraints and optimization processes. And recently, I mean, this is just from a year ago, we've started using, we've developed deep learning technology that makes it increasingly easy to automatically track and even to identify individuals that look identical to a human and reconstruct visual fields. The software is agnostic to organism. It can identify these mice, for example, even though the video quality is poor, and even all of these individual Drosophila flies. And in addition, we have lots of visual tools, and it's much faster and free and open source than alternative solutions. So what I'm really excited about is this relationship between individual and collective computation, and how social connectivity brings minds together, and what higher order computational properties emerge from that type of process. And so a hallmark of collective behavior is that the change of behavior of one or a few individuals within a collective can propagate, can influence others, such as this escape behavior exhibited by fish. This is actually driven by two giant neurons. So it's a reflex reaction, but you can see it propagates rapidly through the group, allowing individuals that don't even detect a threat to respond to it. So we've developed software, as I showed you before, that can reconstruct the sensory information that the individuals use. We work with highly visual species. We also work with other species that use the lateral line and detect pressure and all sorts of other things. But today I'm going to focus on visually mediated collective behavior, specifically choosing species where that's the predominant modality. And yet you can see, if you look at the left visual field in red and the right visual field in blue of this randomly selected individual near the center at the bottom, that this is a very complex time-varying scene due to the self-generated motion and the motion of others. So the early models of collective behavior ignored this. They sort of thought of individuals as interacting with a fixed number of neighbors over a fixed distance, both of which are not correct. And so by reconstructing these visual fields and actually using inverse methods to understand how individuals translate that high-dimensional sensory information into low-level movement decisions, in this case, this alarm behavior that I showed you, we can reconstruct these hidden networks of interaction. So if you're interested in how individual intelligence arises, you can go into the brain and look at the physical and functional connectivity of neurons. But we can't see that within non-technological social systems, such as these schooling fish. Here, we need these techniques to reveal these networks. And these are not just who's close to whom. These are actually based on the information they utilize and how they utilize that. So these are explicitly probabilities. And if we zoom in, we can see, as in many social systems, we have weighted and directed networks of communication. I might be strongly influenced by you, but you not by me. And that's a common feature of social systems. I also find, this is a real fish school, I also find these networks very pretty. And we've analyzed the network properties, and they're not a small world network, they're not a scale-free network. They're in their own class that has unique properties for minimizing information correlation while maximizing the rate of information spread. And so to summarize a bunch of work over the years, we've shown that computation is an emergent property of the network. So computation is not just occurring in the brains of individuals. It's also occurring in this network of communication in terms of regulating social contagion, in modulating behavior in response to increased risk. When the world is perceived to be more dangerous, individuals do not change how they compute in their brains, they change the structure of the network, and that changes the signal to noise ratio and the responsiveness of the collective. They also can sense long-range environmental gradients via the network. Individuals themselves cannot sense these gradients, yet the collective can. And we've also taken great care to show that this does not rely on anything like group selection. Purely genetically selfish individuals will readily evolve these types of collective properties. So even though the level of selection is wildly different to neurons in the brain, nonetheless, there are certain hallmarks of computation, such as the network connectivity and changing the weights of the network to change computation, that we also see within the brain. So I'm going to discuss some old work now, because it's going to set the scene for some ongoing work that we're doing at the moment. And that's trying to understand how animals within groups, I'm showing pictures of fish, but you can think of birds. Later, I'll show you data from primates and a little bit on humans, how individuals come to collective decisions and how individuals that have information can guide others. So how do grouping animals make informed unanimous decisions? Does an individual with information, for example, it knows part of a migration route, or it knows there's a food source there that the others don't know about, does it need to signal to the others, I know what's going on, follow me? Well, we have no evidence of that in most systems. We do also study the evolution of signaling, but that's outside the scope of today's talk. Do others need to recognize who has information and who does not? Well, we don't have any evidence, and as I'll show you, we don't require cognitive sophistication for highly accurate collective decision-making. Individuals reconcile a goal-oriented vector with vectors pointing towards other individuals. And when we came up with this model, this was speculative. However, what I'll show you later on is now quantitative experimental data that really shows that the brain represents space in this way. And so here, if we look at a group, a simulated group, I'm going to have individuals colored white. They start at random positions, random orientations, but the white individuals have a preferred direction of travel. Now that color is only indicative to us, so we can see who's informed and who's not informed. But in the model, there's no way of knowing the informational status of others. You can't read their minds. So the colors are just for us. And here you can see the preferred direction of travel. And you'll see that with no signaling, with no individual recognition, nonetheless, this information about this preferred direction percolates readily across the group. And we've also tested this type of these concepts experimentally. These are real fish, where the red ones are informed, the blue are uninformed. Fish have incredible memories. After 6 or 7 trials, they can remember for many, many months. It's completely untrue that they have this short-term memory that you see on cartoons and on television sometimes. And indeed, as we increase the number of informed individuals, as we predicted, we steeply increase the information transfer accuracy at first before it plateaus. So you could see that contagion of information percolating across the group. But so far, the informed individuals have all been in agreement regarding where to go. But like in human societies, within these groups, there can often be disagreements. Some might want to go one way and others might disagree and want to go in a different direction. How, if, can they come to a consensus? And if so, how? So can they make collective consensus decisions? Well, what turns out to be important are the number of individuals with each preference, the strength of those preferences, which I'll come back to in a moment, but also the fact that these decisions are made explicitly in space-time, explicitly as animals are moving through space. And so the angle, the degree to which they disagree is also going to be very important. So I'm going to keep one informed subset to always want to go along the x-axis at 0 degrees. That's the lower dotted line shown here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the angle to which the other group, the other subset, disagrees with them. It may be just 5 or 10 degrees, such as to the left of this figure, or all the way up to 180 degrees, where they want to go in exactly opposite directions on the right. So the top dotted line shows you the angular disagreements. And for every degree of difference of opinion, from 1 degree to 180, I run 40,000 simulations and then ask, where does the group go? And so in this particular example, the exact numbers don't matter, but this example, there's a group of 100 with 5 want to go one way and 5 want to go in a different direction. And what we find is below a critical difference of opinion, the whole group splits the difference and they move in the average preferred direction, even though no individual explicitly can calculate what that is. However, if you imagine that they're going towards a red target to the left and a green target to the right, if you're far away from the targets, the angle will tend to be small, but as you approach them and get closer, this angle will tend to increase. And what we predict is that a sudden critical angle, they will now all go one way or all go the other in a winner-takes-all dynamic. So they've switched suddenly from averaging to consensus decision-making. And so here you can see an example. So it's 50-50 which option they'll choose, because there's an equal number with equal preferences. In this case, they choose the red option. But if I add just one extra individual to one of those informed groups, so 1% of total group size, I remember they start at random positions, random orientations. You don't know if anyone disagrees with you or agrees with you. You only know your own informational state. What we find is that below the critical difference, below the critical angle, they do exactly as before. They adopt the average direction. That moves them towards the targets. And then they reach a critical point. But now, instead of it being 50-50, this tiny difference, even though they're just local stochastic interactions, they have no ability to count, they will almost always, 99% of the time, choose the majority preferred direction. And so here we can see I've just added one extra white individual, and I hope you can even get the hint of the local noisy nature of interactions. yet collectively, the system is incredibly accurate, even though the components are highly inaccurate. And this is a very general type of model. The exact formulation doesn't matter. We've been able to even apply it to quantitatively predict how humans influence each other within crowds. We can also look at regimes where individuals become very strongly opinionated. The strength of the opinions becomes so strong that no longer can they come to a consensus. We've also looked at scenarios where uninformeds can learn about targets and so on. And one particularly interesting aspect, which again, for time reasons, I can't go into today, is that when I wrote the paper, it was, isn't it amazing that they can do this despite all of these uninformed individuals? It was only later that we realized it's not despite them, it's because of them. The uninformed individuals act as a social glue, preventing extremists from taking hold. And they actually return control from extremist control to democratic control spontaneously. And this didn't go down too well with Rand Paul. Some of you might be familiar with him. So he got the species wrong. He certainly got the amount of money that I got to do this study wrong. But he said he was going to call Obama and get all my funding cut, which thankfully didn't happen. But you know, it just goes to show that perhaps he should read the research. And in the supplemental materials, actually in the main paper as well, we also looked at models from the social sciences to show how this plays out. And there's even been some studies in one in Nature showing this also works for simple human decision making. And around that time, I also started getting interested in work of my colleague Bill Bialek at Princeton, who was a physicist who had a wonderful paper in Nature showing a formal connection between spin system models used in physics to study magnetism, and also by social scientists. A Voter model, for example, is a spin system model, and the cortex and how the brain works. So again, I don't have time to talk about this paper, but I really started getting interested in the internal collective dynamics of decision-making, as well as the process by which multiple brains connect together. So both how neurons connect and also how brains connect. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about today. And when I wrote this article, I was very skeptical about a strong relationship, because the level of organization is so very, very different. The cognitive complexity is so different. The level of selection is different. Surely there can't be a real connection across these wide scales of organization. Well, now I believe there is, and that's what I want to talk about. So I think there is a formal computational connection and a meaningful connection between regarding spatiotemporal computation across vast scales of biological organization. So as I said, I got interested in how neural collectives, how individual brains make decisions. And there's been some remarkable work, both in invertebrates and in simple vertebrates like fish, and complex vertebrates like rodents and primates, that looked at how the brain actually encodes vectorial information. And effectively, I see this as coming to a consensus regarding where the individual animal should go in space-time. And so to study this phenomenon, it's quite tricky, and I'll mention a little bit later again why this is the case. But if you remember, when I added that one extra individual to my group and I flipped the group decision, well, whenever we see a bifurcation, this is indicative that there could be ultra-sensitivity. And if there's ultra-sensitivity, that's a great thing for a decision-making system, but a very difficult thing to actually study, because any accidental asymmetry in my lab environment could break that symmetry without me knowing it. So we invented immersive holographic virtual reality for freely moving animals. So this is based on an old illusion called an anamorphic illusion. It's a very strong illusion. I can tell you right now that this tape does not have a volume above the table. This is purely an illusion, and you'll see it broken in a moment. It never did, but even if it's put into roughly the same position, again, your brain has evolved to pop that back into a volumetric perspective. And so we thought, well, if humans can be so easily fooled, surely animals can. And so the idea here is if you track the animal and you use a computer, not cutting out lots of pieces of paper, but use a computer to render the scene 100 times a second from the perspective of the animal, it can move in behind and interact fully with whatever virtual objects we display. So for example, we track the animals at 100 Hertz, and we can present arbitrarily complex environments. It looks weird to us on the left because it's projected so the fish sees it as if it's like that tape or that shoe to be there in the tank with it. This is sped up. This is a juvenile zebrafish. But the animal will avoid it even though there's nothing there. It's just light. Similarly, we can create photorealistic virtual fish. So here you're seeing a real zebrafish with a red trajectory following a virtual holographic fish that it believes to be in the tank with it. So finally, we can actually control things in ways that were never possible before. Now, one limitation is because we have to precisely project the world from the perspective of one individual, we can never put more than one individual into the tank. The world will look distorted to the other, just like moving the paper suddenly broke the illusion. But what we do is we can network the systems together so the individual in the nearmost tank can interact in real time with a hologram of the individual in the second tank, the third tank, and so on. And we're building 15 of these environments at the moment. And so here you're seeing for the first time 2 individuals that are not interacting in the same physical world, but in the same holographic world. And we call this the matrix for obvious reasons. And again, I don't have time to go into details, but we've gone to great care to show that they really believe these to be conspecifics, not just a moving object. They respond to them in exactly the same way in the holographic world as they do in the real physical world. And here's multiple, this is 4 network systems. And so this gives us lots of opportunities to really untangle, like we can play around with space-time in ways that are not possible in conventional experiments. But because we're interested in biological principles, we also look at the Drosophila brain. So I never thought it'd work on this little creature, but there's good reasons to do so. And also we have this large motion compensating sphere that allow us to do virtual reality for animals such as this locust, desert locust, moving in an infinite space. So lots of advantages that we control the inputs and we can easily quantify differences. And it really gives us a unique capability to determine how the brain translates sensory inputs into decisions. We can do parametric systematic scans. We can connect theory to data in ways not possible before. And we can finally control causality of social influence. So coming back to this question of how do animals decide where to go in space, it's a bit like the question, and this was what inspired me to study this. I was amazed it hadn't been studied before. How an animal, when it's moving towards 2 targets, how does it decide between them? And so we developed a simple model where neural ensembles who are sort of effectively voting for the options that they prefer, a bit like an opinion dynamics model. Those with similar preferences, with similar directional preferences, excite each other. And those that differ, have different opinions, so to speak, about where to go, inhibit each other. And in neuroscience, this is called a neural ring attractor network. But it's formally identical to opinion dynamic models, and we show that in the supplement to our paper. And even, after we published this, the ring attractor has even since been found in the zebrafish brain. We already know it exists in the insect brain. And so what we predict with this theory is, as we saw for the animal groups before, if the animal on the left-hand side of this phase diagram is far away from 2 options, we predict that the brain should choose the average between the 2 options until the critical point, which is indicated by the solid line. And irrespective of how noisy the brain is, which is the y-axis, it will always go through this bifurcation and has to then switch to a state where it chooses one option or the other. The gray regime is a hysteresis regime, whereby once the brain chooses an option, it doesn't go back to indecision. And so if we think about how this plays out as an animal moves through space, the animal, if it's moving towards 2 static targets, which are those red circles to the right, it should be expected we should see this bifurcation in the dynamics. The animal should move up to a point, a critical point, and then suddenly choose one or the other option. But we could not find any data at all for any system, for any biological organism, where people had actually measured the path that animals take as they make decisions. It's almost as if people think the animal makes a decision and then movement is just the output, it's just how it gets to where it wants to go. Whereas in our theory, it's not at all, it's an embodied process. The movement changes the sensory inputs, which changes the movement, which changes the sensory inputs and consensus dynamics. So we conducted experiments with fruit flies, and the heat maps just show you hundreds of trajectories, like where, how the system behaves, so how the animals move through space. And similarly for the locust, showing this clear bifurcation as predicted by our model. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important to explain how and why animals move the way they do. But this comes back to this issue of ultra-sensitivity. Anytime we see a critical point or a bifurcation, there's a universal property where susceptibility, the sensitivity of the system to external inputs is optimized. This could be extremely beneficial because it allows a really noisy brain to suddenly become ultra sensitive and be like a supercomputer only near and at that critical point. And this is an emergent property of the complex system. It's not something one needs to put into the model. So at this point, any difference in neural activity, which is normally completely damped by noise and invisible to the system, becomes amplified. And the animal, even if it comes in from different angles, will cross this transitional point. And so we argue that this is a new principle of decision-making. We know that perceived difference between options is important. If it's easy to tell the difference between things, you can make fast and accurate decisions. If it's hard, then you need time to integrate those decisions. But this is all true. But taking these as true, there's also another factor, an additional factor, that where the options are plays a massive role. So, before, if you had one option that's slightly better than the other, so in our animals, the black is slightly preferred to the dark gray, people wouldn't imagine there'd be any difference between putting the animal between the options or to the side if the distance is the same. In fact, most biologists start them between two options as default. But we predict from our theory that this should create a massive difference in decision-making accuracy. And working with an undergraduate, Lisa Ecker, we tested this and indeed found for these hard decisions, the animal really struggles if it can't go through the bifurcation, but the brain can amplify the difference if it can. Also, we found that our model spontaneously deals with any number of options. So here's just 3 options. Most decision-making models really struggle to scale. This scales naturally. And if we're correct, what this argues, what this shows us, again for free, is that the brain breaks down spatial complexity in the world by turning the world into a series of repeated binary decisions. And at each critical point, the brain becomes spontaneously and emergently incredibly sensitive to any differences between the remaining options. So we tested this theory, and this needed an order of magnitude more data, but indeed that's exactly what we found, this double bifurcation of how animals deal with spatial complexity. And as I said, it works with any number of options. It works in 3-dimensional environments and all sorts of other things, and produces lots of pretty pictures. But if this is a true principle, we should also be able to look at it in a very different brain. The fly and the locust are highly divergent evolutionarily, but they're utterly divergent from a vertebrate, such as a fish. So using exactly the same model with exactly the same parameters, we applied it to a different ecological context, schooling. And so here now, instead of having static targets, here we have 2 virtual targets. So these are 2 virtual fish, virtual conspecifics, that are moving through space. And we ask, where does the real fish choose to be? And again, the theory predicts as we change the distance and therefore the angle subtended, then the brain should exhibit a bifurcation, which is indeed what we found. And again, if we deal with a larger number of individuals, such as 3 individuals, the brain should exhibit a double bifurcation. That looks a bit different now because of the moving frame of reference. But without the theory, we wouldn't know what experiments to do. And we certainly, even if we did, we wouldn't know how to interpret data such as this. But this really shows us that there's good evidence that the brain is dealing with spatiotemporal complexity in this way. We're now working with Armin Ball, who's recently moved from Harvard University, who's an expert in whole brain cellular level resolution imaging. And we're building a microscope that allows us to put animals into the virtual environment, zebrafish into the virtual environment, swim freely with others, but also while imaging their entire brain. And you know, one thing I realized in the revisions of that paper was, oh my goodness, all flocking models are wrong. Because if you give a flocking model 3 options, the left option will cancel the right option and they'll just go down the middle. And indeed, we'd returned to classic flocking models and showed that they all fail. They can't actually make the decisions we know animal groups do make. And so inspired by the brain, we introduced a forgetting factor. If you keep going away, you know, if you want to go this way, but you just keep going in a different direction because you're with the others, you begin to forget your old preference. And that alone allows us to recover this hugely beneficial property of having this amplification due to the bifurcations. You know, I argue that this is a very strong effect and it's independent of exact model formulation. So we also tested whether this can explain decision-making by primate brains in the wild with my PhD student at Princeton at the time, Ari Strandberg-Peshkin. And so here we put GPS collars and accelerometers on almost all of the adults within a baboon troop. And this was work led by Meg Crowfoot, co-director here, who did these experimental studies, and Ari and I worked on the data. And so every second you have the location of these animals. And we found that dominance didn't matter, whether you're male or female didn't matter. It really was a democratic process of decision-making. And we found tens of thousands of events where some individuals wanted to go one way and the other individuals wanted to go in a different direction. Yet the system as a whole would almost always come to a consensus, as we could ask what's going on in the brain of the individuals there. And we were able to show that if they perceive equal options, as the angle changes, we exhibit this bifurcation, but as symmetry is broken, they strongly prefer the majority preferred direction. And we've also extended this to look at flocking birds. These again are real data looking at leadership and decision making. Yeah, thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this really excellent talk. That was fantastic. While people are finding their raise hand button, I will ask the first question. The critical point where bifurcation occurs, what does it depend on? Can it be predicted in advance? Is it species specific, or is it related to neural configuration of a particular species or a particular environmental property? Can we predict when is it going to occur in advance based on something? Thanks.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. And so we can, and we have worked, well, so I should mention I collaborated on this with Nir Gov at the Weizmann Institute, and he's also been working on this. And so we were able to fit our model to the experimental data. And it could be a coincidence, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the data is, the parameterization is exactly the same. There's only 2 free parameters in our model. And the parameters are exactly the same in the 3 systems that we studied. Like neural noise is about 0.2. And so it's in the hysteresis regime. So yes, we can predict probabilistically the angle, but because there's a hysteresis regime, we can't say, you know, from experiment to experiment, it's going to differ. And that's to be expected. But one extremely important aspect that I sort of glossed over today, and that's work I'm doing with Dan Golbanos, who used to work, he was a black hole physicist actually at the Weizmann and is now working with me here, which is that the animals are not dealing with space in a Euclidean way. They are warping space in a non-Euclidean way. They're stretching space in front of them and compressing it behind them. And that is essential for decision-making to occur. And we can even show that if you have 4 options without that, you can get stuck in infinite loops and not be able to make decisions. So we're now testing these theories. And so I actually think that they're in a sweet spot. They're in a specific regime, really for a good reason. I mean, another way of thinking about it, if you have the 3 options, a central option and 2 options to the side, tuning the parameters one way or the other biases them to the outside options or to the center option. They happen to be tuned such that they are completely symmetric with respect to the options. What does that mean? That means you amplify quality and you do not get overwhelmed by spatial relations. And so I think I mean, we're following up with a much more technical paper soon that will address many of these issues. And I think, well, there's also fractal decision-making. There's also all sorts of, I simplified it. It's not always a simple binary bifurcation. Sometimes you can get three bifurcations and so on. And so there's much more to follow, but you're absolutely right. They are tuned. All three systems seem to be tuned, and they seem to be tuned into a regime that is highly effective for good reason.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I have one more question, but maybe I will keep it for later because we're actually right on time for Alin's talk, and then we can have more involved discussion later. Alin, would you like to take it away now?
Sure. Thank you, Marta. People can hear me? So very excited to be here in my office by myself to give a talk and see no faces whatsoever. Joking aside, I'm excited that this is such a multidisciplinary, very interesting group to speak with. So I'm going to talk about grounding collective level phenomena and sociocognitive mechanisms. I want to say, Marina, I'm going to keep track of time. So about 30 minutes. Could you give me some sort of a nod at the 30-minute mark if I go over it so that I know that I'm done and I should wrap up, okay? Because every time I give a talk, I actually run over and I never get to talk about my amazing group. Here they are. I'm just going to especially acknowledge Bill Thompson, Diego Reinero, Casey McMahon, who worked with me on the Collective Beliefs project that I'm going to talk about in part of today's talk, and then also Ida, Mominjad, Andrajana, and Ray Drock for the Collective Memory project that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so just to start with, I just want to start by saying that in exploring collective level phenomena from a psychological perspective, we recognize three important features of their formation. First, if you take a community of individuals of this form, the first feature of the psychological investigation of collective phenomena is that they're psychologically grounded. That is, if you take a cognitive level phenomena and you upregulate that, that's going to lead you to some sort of a collective level emergent process of this nature. People are going to cluster in their group. That is, they're going to form group-based collective memory or collective beliefs or collective emotions. And if you downregulate that cognitive phenomenon, you might get a different type of emergent outcome. So first, I want to claim that collective phenomena are psychologically grounded. They're so interactively constructed. That is, people talk to one another, they interact with one another, they shape each other's mental representations, and that shaping actually percolates to a higher level, and they impact the collective level phenomena. And then finally, they are dynamic in nature. That is, I don't want to say they're cyclical the way I'm showing. Sometimes they are, but most of the times, I just want to claim that they're in flux. They're in constant dynamics, and it's important to understand that dynamical form that they're taking. Okay, so I just wanted to set it up a little bit to say that in investigating this collective level phenomena from a psychological perspective, these are the assumptions that go into that investigation. And there's a paper we published in 2018 explaining a little bit the approach that we're taking. Now, to become a little bit more concrete in the approach that we're taking, so what we're saying is that you have a community of individuals. These individuals have some sort of mental representations. These mental representations could be anything really, like memories, for instance, the way people remember the September 11 events, for instance, right? You have different individuals remembering different aspects of the September 11 events, and the shading in the figure, what you can see there is that some memories are more salient or more active than other memories, basically. And then if you allow the individuals to talk to one another, what's going to happen is they're going to align or misalign their mnemonic representations And then, as I mentioned, you can think about this process as collective memory, but it could also be collective beliefs. People believe certain things about COVID, and then they talk to one another and they shape each other's beliefs in those conversations. It could be emotions, how happy, excited, sad, depressed they are after learning that Biden won the presidency or something like that. So then there's these mental representations that are shaped in the interactions that people have with one another. Now, the idea is that if there's some sort of regularity emerging out of these interactions that people have with one another, the approach that we're advocating for tells us that we have to look at the cognitive processes that allow for that systematicity, that regularity to occur. We have to understand the social level dynamics that occur at this interactive level that might impact the collective level outcome. And also you have to look at the network structure of interactions to understand how that constrains or facilitates the emergence of a large-scale outcome. I realize that I may be blocking the view. Okay, so
it's okay.
So then let me kind of go right into it. I'm going to tell you about two different projects. One of them focused more on the cognitive level impact of large-scale phenomena, and then the other on the social side. There are interesting things that are happening at a social interactive side. The first one is going to be concerned with collective memory, the second one with collective belief. So with collective memory, to illustrate my point, let's say that you want to understand the Russian representation of history. You go to Russia, you survey the population, a nationally representative sample, and you ask them, what are the most important events of Russian history according to you? So then they're going to start giving you some sort of events, and then you aggregate all of those events that you obtain from all this nationally representative sample. And what you might end up with is this sort of representation. They think that the Great Patriotic War is very important. It's part of the collective memory. Patriotic War, this is a little bit of jargon. Russians refer to the Great Patriotic War. This is World War II. Patriotic War is World War I. The Great Northern War, that's Peter the Great annexing the Baltic regions at the beginning of the 1700s. So then you might get this sort of collective representation of history if you go and survey the population at this moment. There are some sort of relations among these events as well. But the point that I want to make is that the approach that we're proposing tells us that the shape of this collective memory is impacted by the way human memory works. And to illustrate this point, imagine that Putin comes on the TV and then just emphasizes just some portions of that collective memory. What's going to happen because of that selective practice of memory, which he actually regularly engages in, is he's going to activate that subset of the collective memory of the community that's going to become strengthened in his audience. And then there are certain processes that are going to be started in the collective memory of the community. Some things kind of lose connection and they become more suppressed and more into the background. So then some of them might no longer be represented in the collective memory of the community. And the reason is partly because this is how human memory works. That is, this strengthening and inhibitory processes are triggered when people are selectively processing information. How do we know that? Well, the reason we know that is because there's been a lot of cognitive psychological research showing exactly this processes. So according to this phenomenon, which is called retrieval-induced forgetting, people come into the lab, they study this category exemplar pairs, fruit apple, fruit grape, and so on. There are items in one category, items in another category. Typically is 6 to 8 categories, 4 to 6 exemplars per category. They study this information. Then they receive selective practice for half of the items from half of the categories, fruit A, fruit G, and they're supposed to think about what they studied initially that started with A and with G. And this creates 3 conditions, RP plus, RP minus, and NRP. This comes from retrieval practice plus, retrieval practice minus, and NRP. Now think about the example that I gave you with Putin coming on the TV and just emphasizing some information from what the Russian population already knew. These are RP plus items, information that's related to what Putin mentions. Those are RP minus items, information that's conceptually unrelated. Those are NRP items. And then experimenters asked participants to remember all the fruits that they studied, all the drinks that they studied. This is the proportion of words recalled on the y-axis. This is the types of items depending on what happened to them in the selective practice phase, RP plus, RP minus, and NRP. What people typically get in hundreds of studies of retrieval-induced forgetting is information that is practiced, RP plus items, is remembered better than baseline information, NRP. This is called a practice effect. So if you practice something, or if you look at somebody or are exposed to somebody selectively practicing information, then that information is going to be strengthened in your memory. And interestingly, information that's related to what you practice is going to experience the retrieval-induced forgetting effect. That is, it's going to be less likely to be remembered than baseline information in certain circumstances, and we can discuss that in as part of the Q&A. What are the circumstances that kind of allow for this phenomenon to happen? Okay, so what we wanted to see is we wanted to understand whether this selective practice phenomenon that happens when people have conversations impact the emerging collective memory of a community. So the way we did that is we have networks of individuals. We bring them into the lab. In this experiment, we have 12 independent networks, each network made up of 10 individuals. And then they're provided with a stimulus material. Stimulus material is fairly ecologically valid. We call this the Peace Corps paradigm. Tell them, listen, you're going to read this information about Peace Corps volunteers that are stationed around the world. And as part of this material, you're going to be provided some pieces of information. They're provided with 12 pieces of information. There's Mary, who's a Peace Corps volunteer who's stationed in Bosnia and is engaged in action number 1, distributing water bottles to people who are disadvantaged or something like that. And then Adam is stationed somewhere else, Liz is stationed somewhere else, and they each engage in different activities. There are 12 pieces of information that are being presented to participants. And then what we do, we ask participants, now try to remember after they read this information, try to remember everything that you read about. So this is an individual pre-conversational recall. And then what we do is we ask them to talk to one another according to a predetermined network structure. So these are the sequences of conversational interactions that are happening in a network. We do this in a chat-mediated fashion. We use the software platform for human interaction experiments to do this particular studies. And people talk for a few minutes, I think 3 minutes with one another, to try to jointly remember the information that they were provided with. And after these conversations, after this conversational rounds, there are 4 conversational rounds in this particular study, we again ask them to individually recall whatever they studied initially. Okay? And what we do is we compute a mnemonic similarity score between every 2 individuals in the community. So we take 2 individuals, we look at their individual memory vectors, and we say, we compute a mnemonic similarity score, how similar their memories are at a pre-conversation level. And what we do is we actually average across all pairwise comparisons. So all mnemonic similarity scores, that's pre-conversationally. We do the same thing post-conversationally. And then what we get to answer these questions, whether conversations impact convergence, is the following. Pre-conversationally, this is the level of convergence that they have, that is that average mnemonic similarity score. So it's about, I think, 0.5. Convergence could go from 0, where everybody remembers a different thing, to 1, where everybody remembers the exact same thing. So then in this data show that pre-conversationally, post-conversationally, people are more convergent. People's memories are more convergent. It makes sense. People talk to one another, they share information, they strengthen information, and that's why their memories become more aligned. Okay. And now to the critical question, do micro-level local processes affect macro-level outcomes? So the way we do this is we first quantify the macro-level outcome, that is collective memory, and we need a certain representation of that collective memory to be able to connect it with a micro-level processes. So the way to get at that macro-level outcome is we do the following. So if you really think about it, what the data that we have is of this form. Participants remember certain items. So in dark shade here, this item was remembered, this item was remembered, this item was not remembered, and so on. So we have a participant by item matrix, and we transform this a participant by item matrix into an item by item matrix. This, what it does is it just creates a representation of how many participants remember a particular item in common, right? So say item 1 and item 4 is remembered by 2 participants in common. If you come here, item 1 and item 4, participant 1 and participant 3 remember these items in common. And you're going to understand why we do that. And then we use a majority rule to say if a majority of participants in the network remember that item in common, then it gets a 1 in this representation. And if a majority did not remember that in common, then it gets a 0. And then based on this matrix, we create a graph-based representation of collective memory. And this graph-based representation, what is represented here is that the items that are part of the collective memory are remembered by a majority of participants in the community, and also the connections between these items represent the fact that those 2 items are remembered by 2 participants in common. So this is the closest we've gotten to a graph-based representation of collective memory. So now come back to that illustration that I showed you with the how Russians represent their history. We could get some sort of representation of this nature, right? And we could assess the degree to which the Great Patriotic War is something that is central or peripheral to the collective memory of Russians. So going back to our experiment, what we can do is then we can have this graph-based representation pre-conversation, this graph-based representation post-conversation, and then we can compute how central different items are as part of this collective memory of this community, right? And then, interestingly, how can you get to the dynamics of this centrality? So some items become more central, some items become more peripheral after the conversation than before the conversation, okay? And then in terms of quantifying micro-level processes based on the retrieval-induced forgetting type of phenomenon, it becomes complicated because a person has different types of conversations in the network, and then you have to kind of keep track of what is said in those conversations. And that's exactly what we do to quantify what happened at a micro level. That is, these types of strengthening and suppression phenomena that happen, right? So then the way we do it is we just focus on specific individuals in these communities, and we do this computation for all the participants. But I'm just showing you for how we do it for this one individual. So you get this one individual, and then we look at the conversation that this one individual has in its network. Right, so conversation number 1, and then we have the 16 items that they studied initially. What happened in that conversation? Well, in that conversation, the participants remembered item 2, item 4, item 9, and item 10 and item 12, for instance, and they did not remember all the other items. And then the person moves on after 3 minutes to having a conversation with another person, and then we also look at what happens in that conversation. Similarly, with the third conversation, and what we do is we compute for each item something that we call a reinforcement suppression score. That is, for that participant, to what degree an item was reinforced, received some sort of strengthening because it was selectively practiced in the conversation that that person had, or it was suppressed. It was not mentioned, but it was related to something that was mentioned. So here, the way to compute this, you give a -1 score for items that were not mentioned, but they were related to those mentioned, and you give a +1 score for items that were actually mentioned. Items that were not mentioned and unrelated to those mentioned receive a score of 0. And then what we do is we aggregate all these reinforcement suppression scores for an entire network, looking at all the interactions that happened in the networks. And further, we use quartiles to classify the items into items that were very suppressed versus very reinforced versus moderately suppressed and moderately reinforced. And now for this argument that we're making that individual level cognitive phenomena impact large-scale outcomes, this is the graph that shows us we compute post minus pre centrality difference scores, so how much more central items became following the conversations that happened in the network, according to that graph-based representation of collective memory. And here on the x-axis, how much reinforcement and suppression we actually differentiate between items that were highly reinforced versus highly suppressed. And what we're getting is this graph that shows the relation between the micro-level cognitive processes that are taking place in conversations and the large-scale outcomes, the collective memory of the community. Right, so then items that were highly suppressed, for instance, become more peripheral in the collective memory of the community. What's interesting about this is that we pre-test the items before with an independent sample before we even run these types of studies, just to make sure that they're equally memorable and so on. And then so from one network to another, what ends up being highly reinforced versus highly suppressed, these are kind of different items. It's just what happens to these items during this conversational interactions that kind of situates them in this different quartiles as being highly reinforced versus highly suppressed. Okay, so then what I did here is I tried to show this connection between this cognitive level phenomena and large-scale social outcomes. And now I'm going to briefly talk about, in the next few minutes, about the fact that there are interesting dynamics that are happening at the social interactive level that might impact the collective level phenomena. So at this level, I could have taken what I told you about with retrieval and spaghetting, and then I could have continued. We have a lot of studies in that direction and how people synchronize based on this retrieval and spaghetting type of mechanisms. But I wanted to spice things up and then take it to the collective beliefs domain. So here we're interested in the dynamics of climate change beliefs over time. So then we looked at graphs such as this one's. This is a Gallup poll taken from 2001 to 2016. I bet they have more recent data. For the purposes of this presentation, doesn't really matter. But what you see here is that the proportion of participants in the United States of America that believe that climate change is due to human activities in blue or to natural causes in red. And you see the dynamics of belief change, basically. Now, we wanted to understand what could be the psychological mechanisms that might be producing this type of pattern. So we said, taking the approach that I just told you about, you have a network of individuals. You start the network at this level. There are 4 individuals who believe that climate change is due to natural causes. You have 6 individuals who believe that it's actually due to human activities, and then just allow them to interact with one another. According to a network structure. So what happens at the end of the day is people influence each other's opinions and beliefs, and then you end up with some sort of product like this, which mimics what happened in this particular graph that I showed you about. Now, what we're interested in this project is to look at what happens when people have conversations with other individuals, and those groups that they're being part of are either minority groups or majority groups. So then it's for psychologists in the audience, it's an ASH type of experiment, but only with opinions that people have with people hold, in this case, climate change. So then you just see other individuals exhibiting certain opinions in these conversations and arguing for their opinions. And you just want to see, depending on the group composition, whether there are a lot of people who hold your view or there are a lot of people who oppose your view, what happens with your view at the end of the day following this conversation. So that's what we wanted to test in this paradigm. And so you can contrast all sorts of different group compositions, somebody of that nature versus somebody who has conversations with other individuals where most of the individuals support their view. So then, the way this looks in the experiment is we had a pre-screening phase. These are a bunch of participants. We had 192 participants in this case. And then we just asked them, is climate change human-made? We pre-screened them so that we select half of the participants who are climate change skeptics and half of the participants who are climate change believers. Then in a pre-evaluation, we asked them, is climate change real? Is it human-made? Is it threatening to you? To humans. After this pre-evaluation, we grouped them into different types of groupings. So we had majority believers group, equal mixing groups, and majority skeptics groups. We had 48 groups in total, equal number of groups in each of the 3 conditions. And then after they had these conversations for, I believe, about 10 minutes, and these were free-flowing conversations, just express your opinions in these conversations. And these were kind of minimal instructions that they received. In a post-evaluation taking place soon after their conversations, after a distractor task, we asked them, is climate change real? Is it human-made? Is it threatening? And here's how we reasoned about the possible results that we might obtain following this procedure. On the y-axis is change in belief in climate change. In this particular case, it's like whether climate change is human-made or not. So if it's a higher number, that indicates the fact that they believe that it's human-made. If it's a lower number, that indicates the fact that they believe that it has natural causes or climate change is not happening. Okay, and then here on the x-axis is number of opposite view members in the group. So then all groups are 4-member groups, but you could be a believer embedded in a group where 2 other individuals are believers and 1 person is skeptic. You could be a believer in a group where 2 individuals are believers and 2 individuals are skeptics, or you could be a believer in a group where you are the only person who are a climate change believer, and then the 3 other people in your group are skeptics. So then the way we reasoned about what we might get is some sort of a symmetry type result, symmetry pattern, concede to majority. The way it would look something like this: if you're a believer and then the number of skeptics in your group keeps increasing, what's going to happen is you're going to change your beliefs and you're not going to believe in climate change anymore. Similarly, for the skeptics, the more opposing view participants in your group, the more likely you are to change your view. And here's the pessimistic pattern that might emerge. That is, if you are a believer, the more skeptics are in your group, the more likely you are to decrease your belief in climate change or the fact that climate change is human-made. And then skeptics are completely insensitive to the group composition. They are not going to change their view regardless of how many believers are in their groups. The optimistic view is a bendable skeptics and rigid believers type pattern by which the believers are essentially unmoved by the number of skeptics in their groups, but the skeptics, the more believers are in their groups, the more likely they are to change their view about climate change. So let me show you the results. This is belief in climate change, 0 to 100. This is particularly about that item about whether climate change is human-made or not. 0 is it's not human-made, it's natural causes. 100 is completely human-made. So here's what we get. Skeptics are essentially unmoved from pre-conversation to post-conversation. Believers, however, decrease their view about their climate change being human-made from pre to post-conversation. This doesn't tell us yet whether they're sensitive or insensitive to the group composition. So here, I'm going to show you that this is the change in belief in climate change, whether it's human-made or not, post minus pre. And this is the dose, that is how many participants of opposing views are in the participants group. So what you see, the data that we have indicates that the skeptics are insensitive to group composition. They just maintain their position that climate change has natural causes, whereas believers actually are very sensitive or are sensitive to that group composition effect, such that the more skeptics are in their groups, the more likely they are to believe to change their beliefs that climate change is actually due to natural causes. So this is kind of a fairly depressing view of the kind of beliefs about climate change. What I will say here is that we're in the process of running a high power replication to just make sure that this pattern is stable. And as part of this high power replication, we're also looking at potential mechanisms as to what might produce this result. I don't have time to go into it. If you want to talk about it in the Q&A, for sure. And then kind of the depressing conclusion here is that you could have a committed minority, a skeptic, climate skeptic minority, which could essentially overturn the consensus of a community. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now just to say that I hope that I was able to convince you that you can experimentally understand that bridging between cognitive level phenomena and large-scale social outcome, there are interesting effects that are happening at a social level that need to be properly understood in order if you want to understand this collective level phenomena that's emerging. And then for conclusions, I just want to argue that in order to understand collective level phenomena, you need to incorporate psychologically sophisticated assumptions into your models. Just want to draw attention to this amazing paper written by Damon Santola and his group. I don't know if many of you know about this paper. It came out a few years ago, very interesting. They look at this threshold models of collective behavior, and then they find this 25% committed minority are able to overturn an uncommitted majority, basically. And I just want to say, I think it's a beautiful paper, a beautiful result. But if you incorporate psychologically grounded assumptions into this modeling, then you might not get to the 25% threshold model. It's probably going to be different with constructs and beliefs that are a little bit more strengthened and closer to people's core beliefs. This study was done with just like a naming convention, essentially, just like whether the community converges onto a particular naming for a particular individual. But then as soon as you move into more core beliefs, you're going to get a slight, probably different number or even a different shape for those opinion dynamics. And I think in order for you to understand the nuanced way in which collective phenomena is formed in this context, you have to incorporate psychologically deep assumptions. And also, alternatively, to understand the impact of psychology for real-world dynamics, you have to incorporate sophisticated assumptions about people's complex environments. And I'm going to draw your attention to this paper. You've probably heard about it on Twitter if you're on Twitter, or you're going to hear about it fairly soon. I think it's going to become an interesting discussion in social sciences about this paper. This essentially is a psychology effort to test interventions to save democracy, to reduce group polarization in American society. And this is politically charged polarization. And then they test 25 interventions, psychological interventions. A lot of teams offered different interventions to try to reduce this group polarization. And they find very promising results as to how you can actually do that. And most of the interventions were fairly effective. The point that I want to make here, though, is that they are effective 10 minutes after you kind of run the intervention and you test the intervention. But if you look 2 weeks into the future, there you can see that their effectiveness actually is drastically reduced. And my claim is that the reason why it was drastically reduced is because psychologists have to acknowledge that there are a lot of things that are happening to individuals after they leave these types of very short-lived interventions. They're part of social networks, they're embedded in social networks, they go back to their MSNBC, Fox News type of regimen, and then whatever effect of the intervention had on a short scale is not going to survive that type of exposure of individuals. So we have to become a little bit more complex in our understanding of this phenomena and taking into account the complexity of the environments that people are exposed to. And finally, this is also self-reflective assessment. I started with this Russian representation of history. Now, notice that the types of experiments that I presented to you, especially the first part, were not that. It was like fairly neutral information, somewhat ecologically valid, but it was really not as charged as Putin giving a speech to Russians. So I think psychology also has to become a little bit more comfortable going into the field and testing some of our assumptions there in this more complex environment. And that's essentially what we've been doing more recently to try to see how Putin's speeches impact the collective memory of Russians with a study that we just finished running. So that's all I have. And if you have questions, I'll take them.
Thank you very much. That was great. Super interesting. Again, I know that there are some questions in the chat specifically about your talk, so I'll invite people to raise their hands if they want to ask them, and then we can open the discussion a bit more broadly for you and Iain. And while people are doing that, I have a question. Did you think of what would be the role of emotions in collective memories, especially in-group, out-group related emotions, such as in-group pride or sense of belonging or fear or threat of another group? Would they be another node in the network, or would they make the existing connection stronger or act as enhancer or suppressor on particular nodes?
I mean, yes, emotion is obviously very important when it comes to the formation of collective memories, because we don't form collective memories of like neutral information. E equals MC square is something that's shared, but not particularly relevant for our community and for our identity and so on. But we do have papers, for instance, where we show that if people are anxious about catching a disease, for instance, the strengthening and inhibition processes that are happening when they're doing selective practice are completely different than when they're non-anxious. So then emotion kind of gets represented in just like how large is the practice effect or how large is the suppression effect as a function of whether the participant experiences a risk of infection versus not, right? So I think that's how specifically in our studies, obviously I think there are other interesting ways where emotion could play a role, group identification and so on.
Oh, that's super interesting. Could you maybe share the reference in Slack to that paper? Sure. Also, there were calls in the chat to share citations for the last 2 studies you mentioned. So that would be great if you could do that.
Which studies did I mention? Here. Oh, the Damons and Tola and Rob Willer.
Tola and the psychological. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. And then Roger, Iain, would you like to, would you like to ask your questions?
Sure. I have a question for Iain. First. So you showed a video where a fish was kind of fooled by virtual reality to follow a synthetic fish. And I was wondering if an experiment has been run where the synthetic fish is in the same environment with a real fish, and whether a real fish would follow the synthetic one or the real one, and whether there is something about the geometry of the trajectory that determines who is followed.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. So it's not possible to put 2 fish into the environment because of the way it's illuminated. So the fish would not be able to really see the other fish. They're very transparent at this age. They're juveniles. And so that's not possible. But what we can do, of course, is we can ask, we can get natural paths of real fish and play them back to in the virtual environment and ask for statistical properties such as where do you follow, what's the probability of following, how long do you follow, are you paying as much attention, and all of that. And we find this identical in the 2 scenarios. And to return to the other, it's a very interesting question about what features of the trajectories are important. Previously, a researcher has argued that the naturalistic statistics, sort of the burst and glide, the busty nature of the motion is really important. It makes individuals much more attractive. That's not the case, actually. It's not replicable. In actual fact, you can have very sparse information. That's the nice thing about VR. You can make individuals invisible and then reappear. And they can reappear in plausible places or implausible places. So we can ask whether individuals are integrating or how individuals are integrating in time. Basically, we find that for this age fish, for zebrafish who are juveniles, they really just use a very simple control law, a PD controller, a proportional derivative controller, that only utilizes the spatial position. It does not utilize derivatives. Well, it doesn't utilize, it uses long-term derivatives, but not short-term things like instantaneous speed. And actually, interestingly, inspired by that, it was like, my goodness, they're really dumb, was my first thought. But then I realized, no, actually, that's quite clever. They're still able to do all this stuff while having very, very imperfect information coming in. And then we actually realized that the control law could be compared to a human optimal controller. So Danielle LaRousse at MIT has developed a human optimal controller, which takes a day and a half to parameterize for each system, and it's very, very complicated. And it turns out that the biocontroller we call BioPD is within 5% of provably optimal. And so we've then implemented it in robotics and shown that it's really robust. And so, far from being really a stupid algorithm, it just is a very simple and effective algorithm. So I think that, yeah, so I was at first disappointed at how dumb they seemed to be. I was hoping they would do all sorts of future projection and all sorts of clever things like that. But in the end, I guess I'm reasonably happy with them, and we're writing that work up right now.
Thank you.
You had a question for Alin as well, Iain?
Oh, yeah. So your pessimistic result kind of it comes at odds with the Gallup poll that you showed earlier. Is this a representative sample of participants, or how do you explain the divergence?
Yeah, Gallup poll, if you noticed, went all the way to 2016. I don't know what's happening now. Probably there's a decreasing minority of individuals who are skeptics about climate change. But my point is, this is not a representative sample. This is prolific research participants. They were actually pre-screened to be believers and skeptics. We had to get equal numbers because we wanted to group them into the different social formations. The point is, there's something interesting about skeptics that makes them insensitive to this social pressure dynamics and normative pressures that are present in people's conversations. Believers, on the other hand, they are completely sensitive. The more skeptics are in their groups, the more likely they are to change their views. Again, we don't know the mechanisms that allow for this to happen. We have certain conjectures and we're testing them now, but it could be that skeptics, they kind of practice their arguments in a way that makes them insulated from all the counter arguments. And it doesn't happen to the same degree with believers. They don't practice those arguments. Usually they don't go about their life just thinking about whether climate change is real or not. As soon as they're confronted with their views, they don't know exactly how to defend them, and not knowing how to defend those views in these types of conversations makes them more skeptical of climate change. So we're just like drawing attention to that process. We're saying just watch out. It could happen that a committed minority of skeptics could overturn the consensus about something such as important as climate change.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Rob, you had a question, 70% Iain, 30% Alin, and then I'll have
Yeah,
a 50-50 question.
Oh, much more equitable. Yeah, so this could be either a computational modeling question or an empirically answerable question, but I'm wondering, like, if you have a certain configuration of a group and then you add uninformed individuals to that group, I'm wondering under what circumstances that like helps or hurts the group to achieve like the better result, you know, the more scientifically confirmed result, or the resource that is more prolific. And because I guess I can see it going either way, that it might help because you're propagating information. You're acting like a sort of a collective memory to propagate information from one part of the group to the other, but it could hurt just because you're adding a lot of noise.
Yes, shall I have a go at that first, Alin, or would you like to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Iain.
Yes, so of course we studied this mostly in animal groups and in simpler systems, and only theoretically in human groups, but there has been a little bit of work since. But what we found theoretically, at least, is you know, I mean, I'm always cautious to say what is good or bad, because on one hand, you know, supporting the majority sounds like a good thing, right? We called it democratic consensus in our paper, but in fact, if you look at the supplement, you know, if you know, you can actually have a weakly opinionated. Well, basically, it depends on the non-linearity of the social interactions. So we only realized that later. Actually, there's a phase transition. So on one side of the phase transition, certain linearity of social feedbacks, you get the result that we had. The minority will support the majority irrespective of the minority's preference, and they'll reduce the strength of a strongly opinionated minority. On the other side of the phase transition, they do the opposite. They actually support the minority view. Now, what is good or bad is hard to know, because the minority, strongly opinionated individuals, may actually be the ones in the right, or the ones with good information. So I don't think, I mean, we've also done some work to understand under what conditions, you know, does submajority, supermajority, or majority rule benefit on average in evolutionary terms. But I think when we look at human societies, I would be very cautious to say, I think we can report things like dynamics, that you could see, especially from Alin's talk and thinking about asymmetries that may exist in terms of social influence. I could imagine it being swung both ways. But one thing is, it would be predicted that they play a role. But finally, in human societies, often uninformed or unbiased individuals are excluded from decision-making processes. In all of our models, they're included. They're participating in decision-making. So that's another thing that one would have to do, is to encourage unbiased, doesn't have to be uninformed, unbiased individuals to participate in decision-making. But I would love to know more about that. And I think it's a really rich topic for future human studies.
Yeah, and Rob, what I would say is, I think I will stay with my point that Damon's and Tola's paper, like the 25% committed minority, for instance, that overturns the consensus of the majority, cannot stand universally. When it comes to highly charged moral values, for instance, we probably, I'm willing to bet on this, the dynamics are not going to look like that. If there's a threshold model, it's not going to look like that. If there's a threshold model, it's not going to be 25%. There's going to be an interesting dynamic to look into, but you have to look at it in that particular context. You can't look at it with naming conventions and then come back and draw conclusions about the general nature of these processes and what percentage of a committed minority you need in order to overturn. So you need to look at it specifically for whatever you're investigating, and the shape is going to be completely different. And then obviously the uninformed majority is going to come into play there, but it's going to come into play in very specific ways for different psychological constructs that are flowing in the network. If it's memory versus if it's emotion, if it's moral values, it's going to look completely different, including that proportionality of uninformed versus informed individuals. My point is that you have to acknowledge that there's a psychological depth to these processes. If you're not taking that into account, coming up with these regularities is not going to take you too far.
Thank you. And I have maybe in line with this, I have more of a 50-50 question with for both of you. So more generally, how would you say your work relates to the problem of misinformation and collective manipulation of human societies? What can we learn from your work that might help us understand how our societies can get steered toward decisions that are not collectively or even individually beneficial? So for example, Iain, you mentioned how effective collective computation can arise purely from interactions of genetically selfish individuals. How much does it depend on a relatively stable environment? Or when the environment changes, how easy are those collectives manipulated into believing things that are not there? Would the same computation algorithms that worked in a typical environment kind of backfire, and when environment radically changes, either physically or social? Can we study collectives of fish as a model system that can be misinformed and manipulated? Can we manipulate them a little bit? And would it tell us something about how human collectives can be deceived, or how can they protect themselves against deception?
Well, I'm always quite cautious, and I think Alin's talk is a wonderful example of why one should be cautious about extending to humans, because even within humans, you can change the context and you could reverse the results. But nonetheless, so we have a paper coming out, I think next month or the month after. We did this while I was still at Princeton. That's how long it takes to get stuff published, at least in my lab. And we looked at a very large swathe of the US population, and particularly we were interested in political views. So this is led by Joe Coman. I don't know if anyone knows Joe. And so, there we find some interesting results. So on non-politicalized decision-making, we find that everybody, except for the far right or the extreme conservatives, they will be more confident in their answer if their answer is factually correct. i.e. they've got a good calibration of confidence and accuracy for just knowing stuff about the world, except for some reason, and we don't, we controlled for educational attainment and things like that, except for the extreme right wing. Extreme left wing was completely normal, where it was inverted. The more confident they were in a factual opinion, the less likely they were to be correct. We also found that that small population also would only utilize social information. So typically, if you estimate something and you're not very confident and you get the opportunity to utilize social information, you'd more heavily utilize social information, the less confident you are in your own estimate. But the far right didn't do that. They would only utilize social information if it was congruent with their own beliefs, if it already agreed with what they believe. And that means a little bit like Alin was showing with the skeptics. You know, they wouldn't budge, you know, by useful information. And then we parameterized a model based, a Bayesian model based on human decision making. And then looked at how this would play out on networks of increasing polarization, because we're all aware that, I mean, I was just, at the end of Alan's talk, I just checked the Gallup polls. And in actual fact, it appears to be stasis since around 2016. But in fact, if you look at the fine grain, the extremes have got more extreme. So there even seems to be polarization there. And so we looked at how this is expected to affect collective intelligence. And we showed that, you know, this small minority can actually really bring down the Republicans to whom they're connected to detrimentally, so they can have this disturbing effect. And so I was very interested in reading this new work that I just heard about today, about, you know, maybe more hopeful ways that polarization can be avoided. But that just shows, even for that one study, there are non-trivial effects. And so I think one has to be really careful about making sweeping statements. I think questions like minority and majority control are important. Questions of informedness are important, but we need to design and study experiments in specific ways, and hopefully build up a holistic understanding from that. But these are dynamical systems, as Alin was saying, and, you know, the dynamics could fundamentally change, I mean, all sorts of aspects. But I will pass over to him for comments on the more human related work.
Yeah, Alin, in particular, I was just wondering, now you have these networks of collective memories. Can you study then what networks are more or less easy to change or attack or manipulate? Do these skeptics are right? Are their collective networks in a way more resilient to change? Because of reasons?
we have several papers on collective beliefs that kind of approach answering your question. So one is the endorsement of conspiracy theory. So we have some experiments showing that if you socially exclude people, so we have these manipulations, and in some conditions they feel socially excluded and some socially included, they're more likely to endorse conspiracy theories. So they feel socially excluded, they're more likely to endorse conspiracy theories. Now, the interesting collective level dynamic that might be happening there is somebody exhibits a conspiracy theory, they start talking to their friends about it, their friends might be resistant to it, they feel more socially excluded, they're going to endorse those conspiracy theories more, and then to the point where they're going to join conspiracy theory groups and communities, and in that moment they're not going to be excluded anymore, but they're going to be included in a community that completely reinforces those beliefs. So there's this very interesting dynamic that could make these communities extremely tight and very insulated towards any type of change that could come to them. So that's kind of the less hopeful message. The more hopeful message is that with some of the techniques that we developed, basically in terms of measuring this collective level phenomena in communities of individuals, you can map the graph, using graphs, you can map the collective beliefs, and you can understand like what sort of pathway you can take in that community to disconnect some sections of the belief graph that are conducive to conspiracy theories or misinformation, right? And then part of the lesson from the first part of the talk is that you can essentially create some sort of an informational regimen that just emphasizes accurate information in that graph, scientifically accurate information in that graph, to the point where you can disconnect from that belief graph some things that are kind of conspiratorial or incorrect, scientifically incorrect. And it's not by refuting them, not by saying this is wrong, but it's basically by just emphasizing information that's accurate in a very targeted fashion in that collective belief network.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I agree. So I think we have a time maybe just for one last question for Amy, for Iain, and then we need to wrap up.
Thank you very much. I was actually hoping not to show up on the camera with my pajama, but anyway, thank you very much, both. It was great. My question is to Iain, and concerns a little bit the notion of who in the network. So when looking at the data for both the model as well as empirical data, what can you say about leadership? It is always the same agents or same individuals in the group that drives the propagation of the network, and do they need to be spatially located in a specific position? So is the propagation always starting up front, or can it be happening at the back? Are there individual characteristics, and more broadly, perhaps are there ordinal constraints such that an agent or an individual is ranked higher than others?
Yeah, so it's actually, I'll try to be as brief as possible because it's a very sophisticated, complex question. So if you just consider general movement, so individuals do not have a bias or a preference and the group is just moving, what we find is that individuals near the front and the side edges have best access to personal information, obviously, because they have less occlusion, but they also have best access to social information because, like David Santola has shown in humans, social contagion propagates as a complex contagion. And in fact, he wrote to me recently and showed his work on Indian microtransactions and shows it's actually even though the brains are very different, the function is almost identical. I guess that's why our fish are on the front of his book on complex contagion as well. That there's this universal property of complex contagion, and that means that those individuals are most influential. But there's actually a difference between being influential to others and being susceptible to influence. But that's quite a subtle distinction. But then another question arises. Oh, and by the way, so we've got a paper that we just submitted. It also depends on the time scale of the information. If you're responding to a predator, this is a sub-second type response. Well, it turns out that the spatial positions are different than if you're, for example, responding to a food source, which can be many-second response, which is different than responding perhaps to a migratory route, which can be minutes. And so even looking at the timescales, there's non-trivial effects, even ignoring individual differences just by spatial positions. But of course, individual differences, such as self-sorting, could lead to biases in being in certain positions. And we still don't know whether individuals are sort of born to be leaders or become leaders. We did one experiment, Ari Strandberg-Peshkin did it at Princeton, but we never published it, where we found a strong sort of richer get richer effect, cumulative advantage. If in different informational environments, just by chance, if you just get that little informational benefit, just by luck, then you can sort of outcompete other individuals, and this can cause individuals to have to specialize on different types of knowledge in the population. Much more to learn about doing that. We need to do more experiments, but there's still also likely to be sort of genetic differences. We did look for this in the storks. When we were looking at the stork migration, some individuals we could predict even before they left the nest, whether they'd be leaders or followers, but it had nothing to do with genetics. And we've got no idea why you're sort of born to be a leader or not born to be a leader, or what sort of epigenetic factors play a role there. So I would say that we know remarkably little about that topic. We're just scratching the surface, and so it's a really great question. But one last.
Hijack. Oh, sorry.
Yep. One last thing.
I hate to hijack. Oh.
We still don't know whether being closer together is better than being further apart. Naomi Leonard in engineering at Princeton is looking a lot at that, at theoretical models of whether being clustered or non-clustered makes you more or less influential. But again, we know very little empirically.
Thank you so much. And Mita, can I just add another very quick question as a follow-up?
Okay.
Just to try and connect it perhaps to the spatial arrangement that you've described, the warping phenomena. And the reason this is so interesting is that you described the advantage that potentially those individuals or agents on the edges have over others. And if indeed some topological properties, for example, are maintained during those maneuvers, then it would be the same individuals that are likely to find themselves, I presume, at the edges, thus maintaining that information advantage. So it's interesting to know whether, if just by some random luck you find yourself in a position, you will be, selected as a leader for the rest of your.
Yes, and now we have the technology to actually allow us to identify among 50 or 100 identical looking individuals. And I would say you're absolutely right. Until a few years ago, everyone thought these groups were just fully mixed and they were completely anonymized. They call them anonymous groups. We now know that's not the case. We don't know how they do it, but there seem to be groups within groups and all sorts of other structures. So yes, you're absolutely right that we know so little about this, and it's a really important question.
Thank you, everyone. This was great. Iain, Alin, a lot to think about. Alin, we share many of the similar ideas regarding network resilience. I'm looking forward to discussing. And I'm inviting you all to join us for the next Thursday when we have Tina Eliassi-Rad and Gautam Biswas, our own. And until then, have a good weekend and good week.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.